I'm currently chairman of 4 ASX listed companies, Mitchell, Musgrave, Phoenix Copper, and Gia. I sit on the board of AO Energy and a couple of other unlisted entities. So I'm very much operating in that corporate space now, and I think because of that, you can truly a bonus. I'd love to just talk about the economics, so you don't get yourself into, or don't date yourself talking about the technical aspects of some of the topics that the other presenters are covering today. So I'm going to really try to cover 3 things in this very short and quick run through of the economic need to explore undercover. That's why do we explore, and that'll be a very short summary of why we need to explore. The imperative to explore undercover, and that's really the subject of today's discussion. And then I'm going to give you my perspective from a junior explorer's perspective, what we need to do in terms of filling technology gaps so that I can get out there, raise money, get into these greenfield spaces and explore effectively. So just to kick off, I've put a slide in here just to answer that question of why do we explore? Well, it creates tremendous value when we're successful. And I know that's stating the obvious, but once in a while, especially in pretty grim times like this, we need to remind ourselves that discoveries are still rewarded in the market. This is the price chart of Sirius Resources. Fortunately, this is one I'm not on the board of, but I am shareholder, so I'm quite happy. This is a great discovery by Mark Bennett and his team in the Albany-Fraser Belt, which is a greenfield area in Western Australia that hasn't seen a great deal of systematic exploration. And when they found the Nova discovery back in late July, August last year, you can see that they had a 4,000% rise in their share price. So they went from a market cap of a few million up to about that 600 million mark, and they're still sitting there today. So really, that's why we explore. It creates tremendous value. And I'm going to, when I talk about junior explorers, I'm going to come back to this slide and back to the Sirius story and talk about that a little bit more as well. So what's the imperative to explore undercover? Well, as an industry, I think it's important that we constantly try to ensure that our resource inventory matches the demand that's out there. And that's just basic economics, supply and demand economics. Needless to say, and I think it's generally accepted, that readily identifiable resources near surface, they have been found. And I don't need to read through all the bullets on this. I'm going to switch to some work that's been completed by Richard at Minex, and some very good work. When I was researching the topic, I thought, well, I can't duplicate this to that level of quality, so I'll just steal or borrow his slides. But this one shows that discoveries over the years have been getting deeper. And they've been getting deeper in the brownfield space. We're actually looking quite deep now, and we're delineating and coming up with good discoveries at depth. And in the greenfield space, we're seeing fewer discoveries overall, and very few discoveries at depth, really, but we are seeing fewer discoveries overall. What this tells me is that we need technology advances to identify and delineate resources at depth, and that message will come through the talk. Another slide from Minex. This just shows there are fewer discoveries overall over the years, and certainly the trend in Australia, which is the dark blue line at the bottom, is a bit disturbing because I think we're actually falling off at a quicker rate than other regions in the world. But we can have that debate maybe towards the end of the day. And they cost more to find. Now this slide, the red line, is the increase in expenditure you can see over the last 4 or 5 years, but we really haven't seen an increase in discovery rates there. I don't know if you can read the text, but it says expenditure has increased about 8 times in recent years, but our discovery rate has only increased 3 times. And that implies to me, and certainly is the conclusion, that it's getting more costly to make these new discoveries. Now, resource, and I'm going through this very, very quickly because I think a lot of this is self-evident to the people in the audience being in the industry. Resource depletion is outstripping the replenishment of supply. Exploration expenditures, and that's not really what this slide shows, the next one does, so don't, just bear with me. Exploration expenditures and the amount of copper found is on the left-hand side, and you can see again the spike in exploration expenditure in recent times has not really translated into a great deal of new copper deposits coming online, or significant copper deposits coming online, defined as being greater than 500,000 tons of copper in reserves. Now, I'm going to use copper as an example here, and just so that's a bit of background on copper. Another bit of background, and oops. This just shows that the annual production, the refined production, which is sitting at around 21 million tons. So we're producing around 21 million tons at present, and we're consuming about 20.5 million tons. So there's a small surplus there on the copper side. So if you look at the near term, it's probably not a great panic to find resources, but if you look out and forecast a 4.5% growth rate for copper going forward, there's a huge gap coming up in the next 10 to 15 years. And again, being too lazy to generate my own slides, I've actually borrowed this one from Oz Minerals. I'll let you just read the bits and pieces. I'm just going to focus on this bottom left-hand corner, which is a chart showing the current and anticipated production in blue, and that's copper production, tons of production, against the demand. And as I said, you know, currently we're in a bit of a surplus here. When I go out to market and try to raise money for my copper projects, analysts always remind me that copper's in a surplus. It's not a good metal to be in, Graham. Why are you looking for copper? And you have to turn them around and focus on the longer term. And looking out to 2022 in this case, there's going to be a need for an additional 6.5 million tons of copper metal going forward. So that's a huge gap to fill when you think about that in terms of tons and grade. And that's 6.3 million tons per annum, not in one resource that's going to last 20 years. So there is a gap coming. That's the gap that we need to fill. And that's the imperative of why we have to look at greenfield terrains. A lot of the brownfields discoveries that are coming along are providing incremental increases to resources, sustaining increases to resources, if you will, but they're really not filling the gap, and they're not going to fill the gap over the long term. And we've talked about discoveries here, but it's very important to note, of course, that not all discoveries make the cut, not all discoveries go through to production. We do see a lot of activity, and I've taken two examples of my favorite metals, copper and gold. In Australia right now, the Mineral Council estimates there's about 2,000 active gold projects. Now, those of us who are in the industry in this room, we know that the majority of those projects are actually quite small. They're looking for the next, few 100,000 ounces. They're not the multi-million ounce deposits that are actually going to fill the gap going forward in terms of required gold production. Now, of the 2,000 projects that are out there, there's only 10% of them that are actually at the feasibility stage, and I'd say it's fair to say that only 10% of them are likely to go past that feasibility stage. So that's the kind of map that we're looking for, or that we're faced with. So not only are discoveries declining, there's only a small portion of those discoveries that actually make it through to production, and that's important to remember. The same is true on copper and the other metals as well. S&L Metals provided some stats on the copper discovered globally that make it through to production. Basically, in the last 14, 15 years, there's been roughly 100 new significant copper discoveries, and again, significant being greater than 500,000 tons of contained copper. So fairly large deposits when you think about it in terms of tons and grade. You know, you're 50 million tons at 1% copper. Now, 15 of these projects have reached production, and I thought that was actually a pretty good result. I bet if you plot that against greenfields and brownfields, the bulk of those, and I didn't have time to do that, but the bulk of those would be in the brownfield space where they're near mine, they're incremental reserves, adding to existing infrastructure, or having the advantage of existing infrastructure. But it's interesting to note that of the 100 significant projects, that was 400 million tons of new copper metal that was identified, but only 10% of that has actually gone through to production. So that's 40 million tons, 2 years of production in 15 years of exploration. Clearly there's a gap looming in copper. Certainly the same math would apply to nickel, probably lesser extent to lead and zinc, but those gaps are still there. So we still need to get out and explore. And again, to fill these gaps, it's not going to come in incremental reserves. We need to find significant deposits. It's going to come from, or need to come from, greenfield exploration. And I should state that when I say greenfield exploration, I'm really referring to things that have either been too deep, too remote, or too costly to explore in the past. And when I talk about cover, I'm not necessarily talking about that 500 meters to a kilometer. I find as an explorer, even 10 meters of cover is an impediment to exploration going forward. And a lot of the greenfield belts that exist are there unexplored for that reason. They have shallow cover sitting on top of them. For the sake of time, I'll just go through this very quickly, but just to say that although there's been a longer-term increase in overall exploration expenditure, there is a near-term decrease in exploration expenditure. We're certainly feeling that pinch at the big scale, the small scale, the service industry. Now, I don't have to go on and on about that. And this slide just demonstrates that costs are on the rise, comparing increasing expenditure to pretty much flatline number of drill meters, or number of meters drilled into the ground, drilled on new deposits and existing deposits, pretty much flatline despite expenditure going up. So that tells me it's more expensive to drill. And empirically we know that because we're out there, we're doing more admin work, we're doing more clearances, there's more compliance costs. It's more costly to get to the drill stage now than it ever has been in before. So we have to make sure that we're more efficient. We have to make sure that the technologies that we're looking at today and in the future provide for better targeting, so our meters that do go into the ground are more effective. And of course that we're not wasting all our time getting a drill out to site just to come up with a dug hole. Last slide before I switch over to a junior's perspective. Greenfield exploration will be required to deliver the big deposits. This is a slide, again, prepared by Minex that shows the significant mineral deposits throughout Australia, color-coded by their depth of discovery. And you can see most are in that yellow space, that kind of outcropping or 0 to 50 meter space. And then there's very few in the deeper spaces, the green and the blues being the 200 meters and 500 meter space. Interestingly enough, there are a lot of greenfield terrains. The Albany Fraser, which hosts the Sirius discovery in Tropicana, which is a 10 million ounce gold deposit that was found 5 years ago, sits here. The Musgrave space, there's no real dots in there other than I assume this is Angelina and Eagle Babel on the WA side of the border here. Arunta, these are all geological terrains that are accepted. It's generally accepted that they're very prospective for large deposits, yet we don't have any bubbles in those terrains yet. Those are the greenfield terrains locally that I think we have to start looking into these big deposits, and then you can expand that, of course, globally as well. I'm taking a very Australian view in this. Now, I did want to switch gears and just give you a perspective from a junior explorer. There's a general perception out there that juniors are the first movers into some of these greenfield terrains, and while we'd love to be, and we often are, it's not what our investors want us to do. So there's a gap there as well. They're not happy with long lead times between targeting and drilling and discovery in particular. They do view greenfield as they should, and as all investors should, as the highest risk part of exploration. Generally going in where there's little known about the geology, it's usually a conceptual play versus empirical. Usually on the empirical sense, yes, an outcrop to work with, you have an old resource to work with. That's the kind of play that investors are generally backing, especially when sentiment is negative like it is now. So there is a lack of investor support to go into greenfield terrains, and I think a lot of juniors, although they start in greenfields, you see them pull back into known mining camps, and they go after the brownfield plays where the results are shorter term, but the gains are more modest. And as a result of that, we're not generating the big projects and the big deposits that we need to fill those gaps in the metal sector. So that's a problem I see. Now there's a reason for that. I mean, the junior space right now is horrible, and I could talk for hours. But that's why they invented beer and diggers and dealers and things, and I've just done that for a week. So I won't go through this, but there's roughly You know, 750 resource companies listed on the ASX currently. That's a large number. 650 are junior resource companies, and there's currently a couple of hundred of those with less than $1 million in the bank. That's dangerous. These guys are going to fall over if markets don't and sentiment doesn't change. And look, it's primarily driven by global factors. There's not a lot we can do about it in the near term. It takes at least $500,000 to keep a junior company up and running, just from a compliance point of view, so you can see what it means when you drop below that $1 million, or that $1 million mark. There's very little discretionary expenditure going forward, very little money going into the ground. So we can't do much about it in the near term, but in the long term, I think we can drive sentiment in the market. And we can drive sentiment by improving our discovery rates and improving our discovery rates and our targeting abilities. And that's what I'm looking forward to hearing about today with some of the technologies that we'll be talking about. How are they going to enable me to go to my shareholders and say, instead of saying, look, I've got 3 conductors, and normally if you drill 10 conductors, one will come out good. So we're playing the odds here. But how can I go to them and say, look, I've got 3 conductors, and this one's definitely sulfides. You know, that's the space that we'd like to work in when we're selling stories going forward. So I think there's a lot of work to be done in terms of improving targeting. And then, of course, once you have an intersection, it's very costly to drill out a resource. And I'm looking forward to hearing some of the ideas and some of the methods of drilling more cheaply, drilling at broader spacings, so that we can extend our drill dollars when we're delineating a discovery to see if it does have economic potential. Now, that comes down to us as an industry driving sentiment by making better, faster, and more profitable decisions. And again, I'm looking for technology to help fill that gap. And going forward, we often measure our success as dollars spent versus ounces found, or dollars spent versus tons of copper found. For a junior, as an industry, I think it's a better measure if we can demonstrate to investors that our enterprise value, so that's the market capitalization of the company, minus the cash and minus the liquid assets like other investments and things, the enterprise value of the company is growing at a steady rate, we can continue to attract investment dollars. For us, it's not about ounces in the ground necessarily. It's not about the cost of those ounces. It's about demonstrating a continual growth in your enterprise value against the invested capital. As an industry, I think that's a measure we should start using more rather than just ounces in the ground. And with that, I think we'll be able to drive sentiment over the longer term. And I'm hoping that today, some of the technologies that we hear about will help me deliver on that objective. So let's get into some of the more interesting stuff just in the last 5 minutes that I have. Look, we explored to add value. I think Sirius Resources was a great greenfield discovery 13 months ago now. They actually made 2 discoveries out there. You see the Nova discovery, and then the second discovery about 6 months later, Bollinger. They now have a resource there of 14.6 million tons of 2.5% nickel equivalent. This is an outstanding result. That's about 600,000 tons plus of contained nickel. You classify a major nickel deposit depending on which nickel company you work for, bigger or mid-tier, but generally anything over 100,000 tons is considered pretty good. And not world-class, but certainly very large. What's interesting, my points on targeting, Sirius Resources acquired this project from Mark Creasy back in December 2010. At that time, there was a couple of soil anomalies on it. A couple of geochem anomalies. They followed these geochem anomalies up, provided more detail, demonstrated that there was nickel, copper, and PGEs anomalous in soils. That's all good from a nickel signature point of view. They continued along in April, May last year of 2012. They completed some ground EM work, and they identified 3 priority conductors, did some background drilling, some recce drilling. They identified trace sulfides. They knew they had the right rocks. They knew the ore forming processes were working, and they had conductors, the signatures for the significant accumulations of sulfides. But you can see that's not enough to get the market going. That's not enough to go out and raise money on it. And this is what I'm getting to the point at. I'd like it, if you put out an announcement like that, where we can go to investors with confidence and say, well, these targets are definitive, and you start to see that appreciation of your enterprise value. So you're raising capital back here. The interesting part of the Sirius story, and the reason I bring it up, is Mark and his team and the board made a decision to take it to the wall. They had less than $1 million in the bank when they commenced drilling on the Lower Discovery. So it was really their last drill campaign. And Mark tells a great story if you have time to chat to him and time to see him in one of his more less formal presentations. He'll tell you the discovery story. It's a fantastic one. But lo and behold, they did hit mineralization. I do point out that the third hole missed. And I didn't know this, but when I was talking to Marcus, the project geo, and Mark Bennett last week at Diggers, they said, oh, no, we were really nervous because just as we were putting out the discovery statement, we had stepped one section over, 100 meters over, and the first 3 holes were missed. And that's because the ball is plunging, of course. So luckily, this discovery was enough for them to raise capital. It was the exercise of options. They were fully funded. The market cap had shot up over the subsequent months. And it was a great story going forward. There is really no outcrop to work with. The bulk of the deposit sits 200 meters below surface. The bulk of the tonnage, as you can see in this section. And if you can, I don't think you can read any of the text there, but there's some pretty splashy clays coming out of it. And it's now at the conceptual stage of connecting towards production. This Albany Fraser belt has also delivered one of the arguably one of the most significant gold discoveries in the last 10 years in Australia, and that's the Tropicana discovery. Again, undercover, talking about that targeting aspect, this started as a 35 TBD soil anomaly, and then it was a RAB drilling that followed up from there, and then the subsequent RC drilling. So it's not deep cover, but it's still an impediment to exploration. Good in time, I guess this is going to be a shameless plug for one of the companies that I chair, Mitchell, and we've got a great project in the territory, but I'll just skip through that one to save some time. Just a quick point, it's also up to industry to be innovative in the way they explore. There's no point in going to a greenfield exploration belt with a postal stamp piece of ground and trying to make it work. There's also needs to be a paradigm shift in the way we raise capital in doing explorers. In 1989, when I got into this industry, you go to IPO, you raise $4 million, and you go explore. Today,
you go to IPO, you raise $5 million typically, and you go and explore. But costs are much, much higher. It's no longer sufficient, especially when you're tackling a greenfield terrain. Mithril had a large land holding in the Musgrave region of South Australia. We joint ventured basically with 6 other companies and convinced those 6 companies to put their ground into a dedicated vehicle so that we could fund the exploration in the Musgraves properly. Mithril was spending about $200,000 a year in the Musgraves for 3 years. Needless to say, we got nowhere. Barrick was one of our JV partners. Independence Group was spending about $500,000 a year. It's just not sufficient in these remote and covered terrains. So we were successful in putting a company together and going and listing that company in 2011 on a greenfield exploration play, raising $20 million. So that gave us $10 million to go and do the targeting work. And now we're just entering that drilling phase, and we've got $10 million to do the drilling work to make that discovery before we have to go back to market. And I think that's the approach that IPOs should be taking now in these greenfield terrains to be successful. I've talked about a couple of shallow discoveries. I just wanted to emphasize we're clearly making some exciting discoveries at depth, and this one's from South Australia. And I think there's going to be a presentation on it later this afternoon, so I won't talk to it too much. But it's a great discovery at about 600 meters depth. This one was one that came out last week, and I put it in there to remind me to say that the mid-tier and majors are still out there exploring in greenfield terrains. It's not all about the juniors, and we do look to the majors for their support. We have an excellent joint venture in Mithril with MMG on our nickel projects. Rox Resources put out this result last week in joint venture with Teck, where they've hit 13% lead zinc over 23 meters at about a kilometer depth. Now, that's a great result, but I'm not sure what you do with 13% lead zinc at a kilometre depth. Certainly, if it was a junior on their own, how would you afford to drill that out? You know, you're looking at $700,000-800,000 a drill hole. Your budget isn't going to last very long. So we need the majors in there, and I think even the majors would agree that we need new technologies so that we can step out broadly and characterize the search space and decide if it's worth continuing very quickly. Again, making those smarter decisions. So look, that's probably enough for me. I think I'll end it there. And I guess the main message of my talk, other than the self-evident reasons to explore, is adding value, and that we do need to explore in greenfield terrains to find the big deposits to fill the gaps, is that industry can make steps to drive sentiment by making faster, better, and more profitable decisions going forward, and that will help me in my role of raising capital for greenfield exploration companies going forward as well. All right, thanks, Ken. Do you want me to do the next?
I'll give you the mic. Ned.
Not a question, just a comment. The last roll of the dice scenario you explained there for Sirius is a very familiar one. Jubilee Mines was a similar thing before Cosmos, and I think Sandfire before DeGrussa. So I'm wondering, is that actually the cause? Do people actually make better decisions when they're under this do or die pressure?
I think that's a really good point. You know, the slide I had up for Mithra was we've identified you know, a large IOCG province. I mean, there's no deposits in it yet, so it's an early call on province. Up in the East Arunta, we've got $2.2 million left in the bank, and we've got an area that's 50 kilometres by 15 kilometres to cover. Clearly, we're not sufficiently funded to be effective. But do you make better decisions? And I think you do. I think you sharpen your pencil, but there's still that real risk of running out of money. And for every success story, I think there's probably a dozen that have hit the wall, drilled in the wrong place, or just got unlucky. And those projects are sitting out there, or they sat out there until somebody else came along and made the discovery. On the Tropicana, on that soil anomaly, I mean, it was low level, but it was evident. According to Chris Bonwick, it was a standout anomaly, and that sat in the archive since 1990. It wasn't until 2004 or 5 when it was followed up. So, yeah, I think that's a good point.